Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Jordan Cooper. Jordan is finishing his PhD at the South African Theological Seminary in theology, and he serves as a chaplain at Cornell University. And today, Jordan will be sharing his story into the Lutheran tradition. So, Jordan, thanks for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, Jordan, can you start by just telling me about your religious background? Did you grow up in a Christian family? Did you grow up going to church?
Yeah, I did. So I grew up in a Christian family. They were part of a Presbyterian church, so I was baptized in a Reformed church in New Jersey. And so in terms of like denominationally, my family was in a couple different places growing up, but generally within the Reformed tradition. So yeah, I had a very faithful Christian family, and I think I got a good Christian education. Christian high school, so very much steeped in the world of theology in many ways from a pretty young age.
And was that a PCA church or was it a PCUSA church?
So the church I was baptized in was actually a PCUSA church. It was a confessing church. I mean, they held a full subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. But from there, my parents in Massachusetts then were part of an evangelical Presbyterian church, an EPC church plant. And then I went to Geneva College, which is RPCNA. So I've kind of been all over the Reformed world, I guess, in terms of churches. But initially, at one point, it was my goal to be a pastor within the PCA. Okay.
And so when you were growing up in the Presbyterian tradition, was it something that you kind of like fully embraced, or was it just kind of like, oh, this is interesting. I guess this is just kind of the world I grew up in, or did you really find yourself drawn to the teachings of the Reformed tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I really didn't start thinking too much about specific theology until high school when I was trying to work out really what I believed. I definitely wrestled with some of the teachings in terms of Calvinism and, wrestling through my view of baptism and different things. So as a teenager, I did think through those issues. It wasn't just a given for me that those positions were correct, especially because I was in a Christian high school, which was very much varied in terms of beliefs that people had. And even the teachers had very different denominational backgrounds, and they were all pretty open about where they were coming from, and even kind of making arguments in class for their positions, even when it wasn't really the topic of class. But I actually found that a very helpful environment to be able to be exposed to all different views. So as I did think through those issues, I was very much convinced of the Reformed faith. So I wouldn't say that I just believed those things because it was what I was taught. I did very much have to wrestle through a lot of those questions.
And so was it around college then that you thought, well, this is where I want to serve as a pastor in this tradition?
Yeah, I think by the end of high school, I was very much convinced of Calvinism and wanted to be within the Reformed Church to some extent. I don't know how well I knew my theology or exactly what that meant at that point. So then, yes, I did attend college, not with a specific idea that I want to be in the PCA or OPC or anything like that. But just as I was looking into denominations when I was starting my degree, that's pretty much where I landed.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, to what extent was because I'm not sure what year this was for you when you were in college and things like that. What extent was the kind of neo-Calvinist movement influential in your thinking about Calvinism?
Yeah, I guess the new Calvinism seemed like it was kind of at its height probably when I was in college. So I graduated high school in 2005. And that kind of seemed like right after that was the big boom of, what people called the new Calvinism. So it was the time when people like John Piper were getting popular, and Mark Driscoll at the time was a popular figure in the Sovereign Grace movement. So it was very much that specific time when awareness about Calvinism and what people refer to as the new Calvinism was really becoming popular. So it did make sense at that time that studying theology, that would be kind of the air that I breathed, I guess. Those were the resources that were out there.
Right.
And just especially online, the Reformed just had better resources theologically than anybody else out there, and before anybody else did. So, you had websites like monergism.com, which was full of so many resources. And the Reformed seminaries were putting up audio of their lectures when others weren't. So, in many ways, it felt like to be in theology and interested, academically in theology, that's just what you're exposed to, because they were the ones putting the resources out there.
Yeah, that's really well said. And so at some point, you started to question or think differently about your Calvinist leanings. When did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, as a Calvinist, it's not like I was questioning my views really, as a Calvinist until I encountered some opposing views. Now I wasn't, ever convinced of, Arminianism, and many of the challenges to Calvinism from my perspective were basically just Arminian. And I think I was under the impression for a while, which I think a lot of other people are as well, that there really are just those two options. So either you're a Calvinist or you're an Arminian, you're part of maybe the Wesleyan tradition, or just some kind of very historically unrooted kind of American evangelical in some broad sense. So, I didn't really know there was much else out there, and the other options weren't really for me, for sure, until I encountered Lutheranism. Now, as a Calvinist, Calvinists are really into Martin Luther to an extent. They like, the bondage of the will, almost exclusively.
Yeah.
So that was one of the texts that I was always recommended to do it. So the bondage of the will was the first. Actually, I don't think it was the first Luther book I read, because I did read his Galatians commentary first, now that I think about it. Bondage of the Will was the second. But those were the two. The Galatians commentary was the one that was by far more impactful on me, just because of the gospel-centeredness and the pastoral spirit in Luther. So I loved Martin Luther's theology, but in my view, that's just what Calvinists are all just into Martin Luther.
Right.
And there's kind of this common, canard that's out there, that's repeated, ad nauseum, which, I've tried to correct many times, and it seems like it's never corrected, which is that modern day Lutherans are just Melanchthonian. They're not Lutheran. They follow Melanchthon rather than Luther. And so it took really me meeting a Lutheran when I was in college, and he told me about, Lutheranism and kind of corrected some of those perceptions that I had. The idea that, for example, they just followed Melanchthon. Lutherans were essentially just Arminians. And that's certainly not the case. In fact, I was surprised to find out that the Formula of Concord specifically condemns Melanchthon's wording of the three causes of conversion. So it just comes from really a place of ignorance, in making those claims. So, I was just kind of curious more than anything else, because I love Martin Luther so much. So I just wanted to know, what is it that confessional Lutherans believe? Because I was hearing about this thing called Confessional Lutheranism for the first time ever. And I knew that there were some similarities with, Lutheranism, Calvinism. So I really just dove into it. At the time, I would say there weren't nearly as many resources out there. So it's not like there were, a bunch of Lutheran podcasts or, anything on YouTube or the kind of things that are out there now. At the time, it seemed like it was only Calvinism. So I had a hard time finding that. And so I wanted to read Lutheran theological works. I also found that they were ridiculously expensive. And in our school's library, because I went to, a theological college, Geneva College, which has a big theology program. And, in the library, they had a large section for almost any denomination. And in the Lutheranism section was, I think like 4 books long or something. So I couldn't really go there either.
Wow.
So I ended up just starting to purchase books. But, so it was the Book of Concord or the Book of Lutheran Confessions that I read. And then I read through Francis Pieper's Church Dogmatics, which is kind of the standard Lutheran systematic theology text for at least American confessional Lutherans today. So it was reading through those works, and then there were a lot of other factors as well, going into it, but a lot of it was reading Luther, reading Lutheran theologians, and then reading the Church Fathers as well, on a number of issues that started to get me to rethink, I think, a number of doctrines, a number of issues. But I would say probably the primary thing, the topic that I was really thinking about was baptism.
Okay.
The Lord's Supper also. But I think baptism largely was, if I were to say there was one doctrine that I spent the most time looking at, that would be it.
Was that because you felt like there were kind of holes in the Calvinist understanding of baptism, or was that just your own kind of curiosity about understanding Luther's view?
Well, there were a couple of things I would say. One is just Luther talked about baptism all the time, especially when you read like his Galatians commentary. His entire, foundation of assurance is in baptism, which was not the way that the Calvinists that I was aware of were speaking. So that did gave me a kind of curiosity as to what Luther was saying. And I always had an interest in the Church Fathers. That's something that I had an interest in even since high school. I remember writing a paper on Justin Martyr in my senior year of high school and being really engaged in reading that. So I always had this kind of interest in, what the early Christians taught outside of the New Testament. Because of my reading of the Church Fathers, I noticed that they too talked about baptism a lot. And they certainly didn't seem to view baptism as a symbol, a purely symbolic thing. It definitely was regenerative. I mean, that was clear from Justin Martyr through the end of the age of the Church Fathers, whenever you want to date that, Gregory the Great or whatever. That's pretty much universal. So that was the thing that really, it was a combination of reading Luther and the Church Fathers that made me stop and think maybe I need to re-examine what the New Testament texts about baptism actually say.
So that was something that kind of struck you as being at odds with the Calvinist tradition.
Right. And just Protestantism in general, I would say, because there really weren't, evangelicals using the kind of language that the Church Fathers used or that Martin Luther used at all. Now, I was never, because I encounter this with people very often, that they read the Church Fathers and realize, oh, they said different things about the sacraments. Maybe I have to be Roman Catholic.
Right.
And that is a temptation for people. I think if people knew enough about Lutheranism, they wouldn't have to do that. And I was never tempted to go to Rome. And I don't know. I know many who are, after reading the Church Fathers. I never saw that temptation at all myself.
Yeah. What I think I've heard, maybe it was Carl Trueman who said something like Luther would probably feel more comfortable in a Catholic church today than he would in a Protestant church today or something.
Yeah, that's probably the case. And I have a much different view of, the confessional Reformed tradition than I would of kind of a broadly evangelical non-confessional church. I think there is plenty of richness in the Reformed tradition as well. But even within their confessional Reformed tradition, I think Luther would, even with those churches, say that he would be closer to Rome. Luther pretty much said this himself when dealing with Zwingli. He said that he would rather drink blood with the papists than, wine with Zwingli. So he did see himself even still as more in continuity with the Roman tradition than he did with the Reformed. As strange as that is to hear from,
it is strange.
Very much.
Yeah. So you're reading these works by Luther, and how long of a time period are we talking about here? Was it several years that caused you to kind of reflect about your theological tradition, or was it like very quickly that this happened?
No, it definitely wasn't quick, but I would say pretty much as soon as I started studying theology, I was reading Luther. So the questions had been in my mind basically since I started college. And so I would say that I wrestled with these questions for a few years before really making the decision. To be honest, if I knew that Lutheranism existed, I don't know, and I knew what Lutherans believed, it may have been the case that I never really considered myself a Calvinist in the first place. I think what drew me to Calvinism really, I don't know if it's so many of the doctrines themselves, but that this was a place where I could find a more intellectually robust faith and people that were very serious about what Scripture taught and trying to formulate it and understand it. That's what was so appealing to me about Reformed theology, and I didn't see other traditions doing that. So while I was convinced of the Reformed teachings, certainly, I think if I had known about Lutheranism earlier, I may never have really latched onto it. I just didn't know it existed.
Yeah. So can you highlight some really important differences? Like, so we talked about baptism and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. But some more differences between Lutheranism and Calvin and the Reformed tradition.
Yeah, so there are a lot of theological differences. Obviously, we have a lot of commonalities on points as well. So in terms of like the forensic nature of justification, divine monarchism, our perspective on the bondage of man's will and sin, on those points, there's agreement, and those are significant points. So those are not insignificant areas of agreement. That's a lot that we agree on. But there are pretty significant points of disagreement too. So I think the most significant, and theologians have worked this out different ways when it's been asked, what's the main difference? And some people have said Christology. But I would say probably the main difference would be our view of grace. And not the question of what is grace. We all affirm in some sense that, grace is the unmerited favor of God for the sake of Christ. But the extent of grace, because I think that really does drive a lot of the systems. And that is the question of, is grace universal, in the sense that, does God indeed love and desire the salvation of all, which resulted in an atonement to death of Christ on behalf of all, which then results in a gospel call that goes out to all, an earnest gospel call. So that would be the Lutheran position, which differs greatly from the Reformed position, because even going back to, eternity past in Reformed thought, everything begins with a covenant of redemption between the Father and the Son, where the Father elects a specific people and not others, and the Son agrees to die for those specific people. And I think the rest of the system really comes out of that, and that impacts views of things like the sacraments, your view of perseverance, view of the atonement. So I think on that fundamental basic level, even going back to eternity past, there's a difference. Has it been the plan from eternity for Christ to die for all and for God to save all, though not all eventually will actually be saved? Or has this plan always been simply and only for a particular people and specifically not for others?
Right. So I know in one of your videos you talked about encountering this sense of, I just like dealing with the biblical data at some point just became too difficult with, I think maybe we were talking about perseverance of the saints or something like that. And that you realized that it was very difficult to maintain that position and still deal with all the passages in an honest way.
Yeah, perseverance is a major issue, because I that's exactly the case. Is that, and I, to be honest, I always struggled with this as a Calvinist, and that's why one of the reasons I said I think I may have never even been a Calvinist if I knew that Lutheranism existed, because when I went through the texts, I was actually on board with all 5 points of Calvinism other than perseverance. And that was the one I struggled with the most. Eventually I came to that conclusion because I thought just logically it had to follow. But I never was really that convinced that the texts were clear on that issue. And there are so many warnings in Scripture about falling away, and it's prevalent through, the entirety of the New Testament. And I just couldn't really, I can't square those two truths and those two realities. How do these texts, and there are different ways that the Reformed tradition deals with those texts. But I just came to find that they really weren't just taking the text at face value. They pretty clearly said one thing, and at some point you can't make the text say something that it doesn't say. So that perseverance would have been a major issue. And the verses about, the extent of God's grace being universal. I was very well versed in how to explain away those texts when I had debates with Arminians for a long time. and I was all on board with, various explanations of them. But at some point I definitely came to the conclusion that they really they mean what they say. and just contextually, you have to pull out so much, and you can make a case for limited atonement in those texts. But I think you have to import so much into the text. I don't think that just any reader in the first century just encountering those texts would really come away with the interpretations that Calvinist has to force on those texts.
Yeah. Could you tell us, what do you think is a common misconception of Luther or Lutheranism among Protestant evangelicals?
I mean, there are a lot. So Among the Reformed, I'd say the biggest misconception is that we're synergistic. We believe that there's, cooperation between God and man in the work of salvation, which simply is not the case historically. Monergism, or the idea that there is one worker, that is God, in our salvation. I mean, that's clear in our confessions from beginning to end. So that's definitely one of the misconceptions that's out there. Oftentimes Lutherans are accused of being kind of closet Roman Catholics in many ways. And in some ways, that's kind of fair, because we are similar in many ways. And we do consider ourselves, in continuity with the medieval church, though we try to get rid of the corruption that was there in the medieval church. So there is continuity in many ways, but oftentimes that's misunderstood in the areas of where there's continuity. There's, for example, there was a book that I encountered at one point at Barnes and Noble, and it's one of these books that's like religion in 30 seconds or something like that. And it has these little pages of, learn everything about this subject, and these little, snippets, right, which of course are always very accurate and helpful. So, the print version of Wikipedia, but the articles were even shorter. So if you look at that book, I opened it up and I was like, oh, what do they say about Lutheranism? I'm really curious. My wife and I were at the bookstore, and their representations of other religions were wrong too. But in Lutheranism, it made a statement that Lutherans pray to Mary. Oh, wow. In this little chart of what Lutherans believe. And, not that that's one that I encounter often, but that just goes to show the extent of confusion that people have. No, we don't pray to the saints. No, we do not pray to the Virgin Mary. And that's explicitly taught against in our confessions. And Luther's pretty harsh about it. If you look at like the Smalkeld articles, which is Luther's most grumpy statement of faith that we have in our confessions. He's a little bold in that, and when he's a little older, pretty harsh about that issue. So no, we don't believe in praying to the saints. So that's just one example, but there are misconceptions all over the place about a number of different teachings. Okay.
So I don't know how much N.T. Wright reading you do, but I feel like almost every N.T. Wright book feels like a book about why Luther was an idiot and everything has gone wrong since he came out and totally hijacked Paul. What about that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think Wright is a wonderful historian and a horrific theologian, if I could say that. I think I've read a lot of Wright. I think he's brilliant, and I think he's got a lot of great historical insights, and his defense of the resurrection, and the resurrection of the Son of God is masterful. It's wonderful. But I think the problem I have with Wright is that he, and a lot of people do this, is he speaks with authority on areas that he hasn't really been well equipped in. And I think that's just some of the basics of systematic theology, especially Reformation theology. So reading Wright is extremely frustrating when he's interacting with Luther, not only Luther, but also with Augustine and the early church as well. Because the entire basis of the new perspective is this, that Augustine changed something in the way that Western people thought, in the way that they read the New Testament. And Augustine had this kind of guilty conscience. He was this, individualist, and he read, and this is Christopher Stendhal's whole thesis that really started the whole new perspective, was, his essay, Paul and the Introspective Conscience in the West. So that now this kind of introspection that Augustine has influenced Paul and how everyone reads Paul. And then Luther is kind of this arch example of this introspective conscience and this misreading of Paul. In my master's thesis, which is published as a book called The Righteousness of One, I think if you look at the earliest church fathers, before Augustine, the pre-Augustinian period, and a lot of people kind of say, well, they don't have much to say about Paul, because it's true that they don't really talk extensively about justification, and there aren't that many of them writing either in the immediate post-New Testament era. But they certainly talk about things like individual salvation, actually quite a bit, and they hold to certain views that Luther would, such as that the law requires absolute perfection. You find Justin Martyr using this kind of language, and Justin certainly wouldn't hold to a Lutheran view of justification. I think he's confused about that. So I would say that the entire basis of the whole new perspective, which leads to Wright's reading of Paul, is really based on, I wouldn't even say a false reading of Luther or Augustine, even the pre-Augustinian church, but just no reading of them. I don't think there's really been engagement with them. So yeah, I think Wright is a great historian when it comes to, Second Temple Judaism, and a lot of details about how that impacts the New Testament. But I don't think he has a clear grasp either on Luther or on a lot of the teachings of the early church, and I think that's highly problematic.
Okay, so here's one that I personally struggle with. I just finished Case for Character towards the Lutheran Virtue Ethics, and I struggle with Luther's talk about Aristotle. I know he goes kind of back and forth on him, I guess, in different places. But to me, that feels like a way that the church went down a path away from virtue. What do you think about that?
Yeah, A Case for Character, I would recommend that book to everybody. So Luther is very harsh about Aristotle, right? I mean, Luther's harsh about anything he doesn't like. And that's just a fact. That's the way it is. But Luther, for one thing, Luther doesn't define Lutheranism. And this is a problem in modern Lutheranism, is that there was something called the Luther Renaissance that happened after the writings of Albert Ritschl, one of the foundational people in Protestant liberalism of the 19th century, he had this massive study on Martin Luther, trying to kind of revive Luther's thought. This then leads to people like Adolf von Harnack, the church historian, to come up with this, what he calls this Hellenizing thesis that, the early church was more Jewish, and there was this kind of Hellenization of Christian thought through the church fathers, where they imported all these philosophical ideas. So I think because of that, there's this kind of anti-philosophical bent in 20th century theology, which impacts very strongly Luther interpretation through what's called the Luther Renaissance, with figures like Karl Holb would be the major one. And what happens in Lutheranism is that there's this major shift away from just systematic theology, which is why there aren't a lot of Lutheran systematic theologies today, away from that to Luther studies. And Luther studies kind of just totally replaces systematic theology. And there's this idea that there's this broad divide between Luther and then later Lutheranism. This happens in Calvinism too, this kind of Calvin versus the Calvinists idea. And that the systematization of Protestant thought is always bad. So we need to go back to Luther himself and reject Lutheranism. What that's led to is a kind of really idolizing of Luther, I think, in Lutheran thoughts, and giving Luther a place that he shouldn't have. Now, Luther's not my favorite Lutheran theologian. I think he's probably maybe number 3 on the list. So if I'm allowed to say that, that's maybe heresy for a Lutheran to say. But my favorites, my two favorite, and I go back and forth on which one is the best, depending on which one I've read last, would be Johann Gerhard and Martin Chemnitz. And they're just as important for the Lutheran tradition as Martin Luther is. There's a saying that says that Martin Luther, Martin Chemnitz, and Johann Gerhard are 3 in a line of Lutheran theologians of whom there is no fourth. Meaning that, they have a place of preeminence in Lutheran tradition more than anyone else does in the post-Reformation era. So I would say, first of all, no matter what Luther did, he doesn't define the Lutheran tradition. Yes, he's a major figure. Yes, we've ended up with his name in our name, right? But Lutheranism does not mean Luther worship. That's just the name that the Roman Catholics kind of stuck on us because Martin Luther was the person who was at the forefront of the Reform movement at the time. Yeah. So with that being said, if you look at people like Martin Chemnitz and Johann Gerhard, they use Aristotle all over the place on many issues. And that's not just on ethics either. And I think you have to look at our confessional documents themselves. If you're talking about Aristotle, because we hold to our confessions, not to Luther. Luther wrote some of the confessions, but so did Chemnitz, so did Melanchthon, and others were involved in those documents as well. And if you look at what our confessions say about Aristotle, in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon actually says about Aristotle that no one better has written on ethics than Aristotle. Right. That's in our confessions, right? Yeah. So that's something that we're subscribing to being okay. Now, to be a confessional Lutheran doesn't mean every single, historical statement in the Book of Concord is true, but the theological truths that are taught there. But that means something. If you look at the Formula of Concord, there's a debate between some of the early Lutheran theologians about the extent of original sin. A man named Matthias Flacius taught that the substance of man is sin, or man's essence after the fall is sin. which was a debate dealing with Aristotelian categories of substance and accidents, right? So in the way that the Formula of Concord deals with this issue, it doesn't say, let's not use Aristotelian categories, Aristotle's bad. Actually, the statements in the Formula of Concord say every learned person acknowledges that everything is made up of substance and accidents. So those are just two examples to say our confessions actually aren't that harsh toward Aristotle. The confessions themselves have actually affirmative statements on both Aristotle's ethics and his metaphysics. So getting back to your question about, virtue, Luther himself, when he's harsh about Aristotle, and Luther's most harsh statements about Aristotle are all basically from early Luther. They really show up in his early writings. They all really deal with the same issue, and that is that what he refers to as passive righteousness, which is the righteousness that justifies or saves us, that comes from God through faith, that in the medieval church was replaced with Aristotle's virtue ethics. So for Luther, the problem with Aristotle was the way that they were applying those ideas to justification, and that's wrong. What he doesn't condemn is the using of Aristotle's ethics in terms of our life in this world in other ways, in our relationships with the people. Yes, we can talk about virtue, and Luther does at times talk about virtue. And Melanchthon certainly uses Aristotle's talk of virtue. I mean, Melanchthon, while Luther was at Wittenberg, Melanchthon taught ethics using Aristotle's ethics. And Luther doesn't condemn that at all. So I think he recognized the import of it. Luther wasn't a philosopher. He didn't have to be. That's really not what he was doing. But I also don't think Luther was this kind of arch anti-philosopher. But Luther was one for rhetoric. And because his rhetoric was so strong, you can make Luther kind of hate anything, depending on what quotes you decide to take. But I think it's unbalanced to argue that way.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jordan, for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun.
Yeah. Your channel, is it Just and Sinner? Is that the name of your channel?
Yeah, Just and Sinner.
Okay.
Yeah, that's you can find me at YouTube, but I've been doing a podcast for many years, and you can look up my name on Amazon for books and stuff like that too. So
great. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please share with friends and please subscribe.